Just wanted to introduce my friend Christian Selvaratnam to you. It's always good to get that introduction, to have the door opened properly. So Christian and I have known each other for about 15, 16 years. I obviously sound English. I've been in New Zealand 2 years now. But Christian and I were based in York, in the north of England together. And Christian has been has kind of a background with a free church leadership, but then got into the Anglican Church and particularly trained as a pioneer minister in the Fresh Expressions movement. And I got to know him in York. He was planting a cafe church in the city and really targeted young students, university students, and created this quite innovative church expression that had a real emphasis on empowering young leaders into ministry. I love Christian. He's a really good, dear friend of mine. We've had many happy curries and spiritual retreats together with another vicar that we'd meet to pray together. But it's my joy to introduce him. You'll really love his contribution at this time. He's a man of great wisdom and depth. Just finished his doctorate in looking at the guilds and the craftsmanship of church planting. So you're going to enjoy this. Without further ado, Christian, would you like to come up? And I'll just pray. Father, thank you for this amazing man. And I pray that you would just bless him, help him to really structure his words in a right way for us, give him wisdom and clarity. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So good to be with you. Thanks for the pies, by the way. Carl and Nigel introduced me to the pies. You've got them everywhere. Everywhere you go, there's like a little shop with pies. Yeah? Have you had them? Am I the only one? No. I mean, I've eaten my fair share the last 2 weeks. So, loving the pies. Great to be with you. We've got an hour here, and we've got... and guys, will you just work on the ringing? Okay, otherwise it'll just drive me slightly bad. We've got an hour, and I want to talk about apprenticing strategic church planting leaders. What I want to do in this session is maybe just take a little bit of a deep dive and think about how we raise up the generation of leaders that are going to plant the churches that need to be planted. How do we make sure that such people are effective in what they do? In the next session tomorrow, I want to talk about how to re-evangelize a nation and how to revitalize the church through strategic church planting. That's a mouthful, but if we can get through both of those, then we'll be good to go, and all will be well. Well, maybe not, but we may know a tiny bit more about God's work for us. Let me say a little bit more about myself, and this is contrary to my natural instincts. I'm naturally very shy and quite introverted, but I love talking about Jesus, so people often don't kind of see that. First up, I'm the guy that hides when they sing Happy Birthday at your party. And so let me just say a little bit about myself, and it's relevant because I want to talk about training. And the relevance is that I think all theology is autobiographical. Certainly all applied theology is autobiographical, as in, you cannot separate your story from what you teach. You can't. So it's important to know that, but you can never eliminate that bias. So you need to lean into it, and so you need to know a person to know what they have to say. So let me just say a little bit about myself. I came to faith at university with no Christian background. That had a profound effect on me in that I've always held a missional view of the church. That's been a gift to me. That I've always lent on the perspective on the church that is about its mission. And I've loved that, and I've always sought to see more of that. My father was a troubled man. He once tried to kidnap me. I nearly died as a result of what happened. So you can imagine I had a few issues to work through. We worked through them before my father died, but there was some big stuff there. And that is relevant because I want to talk about the things that affect us a little bit, because that affects our training and our readiness for ministry. My first job was as an Anglican verger. If you don't know what that is, it's like a glorified caretaker, but you're paid even less. But it is a great ministry experience role. And it gave me a little bit insight into the church and the Church of England. I've planted several churches, supervised some plants, sent out some others. And so for the last 20 years, I've been very heavily and significantly involved in church planting in one way or another. I work for Alpha. You've got Alpha over here, yeah? I work for Alpha in the UK. Alpha in the UK is a big thing. At least a third of churches in the UK run Alpha. It's the single biggest thing that might pull together all the churches from all the denominations. So I loved that role, serving the church and helping it do its mission really well locally and to be an effective in that. And then recently I've been the Dean of Church Planting at St Hild College. We are an Anglican and Baptist theological college. We train people for future ordained ministry. We train independent students and we'll train anyone, okay? We'll do theological training. Before we consider thinking about apprenticing church planters, it might be worth thinking about the way that most ministerial formation happens. Let me just cut to the chase. I work for a theological college. It is my feeling that the way that most denominations train future ministers is ineffective in producing strategic leaders and church planters. We are outstanding at certain aspects of training, but remarkably ineffective at training people for this kind of work. Now, I'm not dissing theological education. I've done a ton of it myself, and I do it in my job. So I do believe in it, otherwise I wouldn't do it in my job. And it has value. If you have zero theology or you have significant gaps in your theology, you are inevitably setting yourself up for some kind of failure or hiccup along the way. It's hard to sustain preaching ministry over the years without having a good knowledge of the Scripture. Poor theology is often the cause of error, particularly in movements and groups of people. A broad theological education is a good foundation to sustain you for a long ministry. Of course, we need to be familiar with the Old Testaments and New Testaments. We need to know some of the thoughts of the good and great who've gone before us, who thought about it as well. We're not the first persons to read those. We need at least some understanding of the fact that the Bibles we read weren't written in the languages that we're reading it, and so there's some things to understand there, and people can easily, if you miss that step, you easily imagine it's saying something it isn't quite saying, etc. And to understand the cultural difference between them when they wrote it, what it meant to them, and what it might mean to us now. We need to know some doctrine. We need to know some liturgy. We need to know some history, because history repeats. And if we don't know history, we will just repeat the errors of those that went before us. We need some practical theology. We need to understand the relationship between theological ideas and ministry practice, and then also how we might learn more about that, how we might learn from something, how we might reflect and review something. So at least some skills in being able to just process the theology the theological thinking that comes from doing things, as well as the theological thinking that comes from ideas that we read in books. We need some core skills, like budget management and building management and time management, self-management, stuff like that. And, managing money, personally, I think, is extremely dull. But do you know what's more dull? Is when you run out of money, because you managed it badly. So you need some rudimentary skills, otherwise you're just gonna trip over like a pebble along the way. And you also need some personal foundations. You need to understand yourself. Like I said, I understand the wounds I carry from my father. If I didn't know those and how they affect me, then that's just a trip waiting to happen. So we need to understand that. We need to understand how to pray. We need to understand how we thrive. But here's the crunch. Theological study is usually the beginning of development and formation for Christian ministry, but it's certainly not the end of it or all of it. So I'm a big fan of theology, but I can say, raising up students in a theological college, those things alone will never make a person effective in ministry. It might, on a good day, get them off to a good beginning start. I was at Hobbiton last week. I'm visiting, so I'm doing all the hits. I was at Hobbiton last week, and our tour guide was Stephen. And so I'm chatting to Stephen, and it turns out he's new. I thought he's new, so I was chatting to him. I said, hey, you new? Good call. So I said, how does this work? Do they recruit like Tolkien nerds? He said, no, none of that. They hire people, because they can teach us the script. So they hire people who are good with people. I said, how are you doing? He said, I've memorized the script. I'm now learning how to be a good tour guide. Isn't that an interesting picture of how he understood, how the organization he works for understood how an effective person taking people around the Shire might be good at their job? Not someone who comes in and says, I know everything about the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits. No, it's almost like we can give you that. We need to see something in you that we cannot give you. We can invest in that and pull something out of that. So we should have a slightly nervous relationship with classical theological training, certainly how it's exhibited in most denominations when we're thinking about raising up church planters. I don't know if you know the pioneer Roland Allen. Well, you won't know him, he's dead, but you know his books. Roland Allen, in his book, The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church and the Causes That Hinder It, good title, by the way. Not hard to know what the book's about. Spontaneous Expansion of the Church and the Causes That Hinder It. He went so far as to suggest that in his day, missional effectiveness was actually inversely proportional to theological educational attainment. Isn't that scary? Isn't that scary? And doesn't it raise for us the importance of understanding what actual effective training might be and look like for somebody who's going to be in the church and a church planter? So what is good training? Training is generally thought of as having three interrelated aspects, and each of these apply when we're thinking about raising up church planters. And they are knowledge, character, and skills. Knowledge is mostly what we've just discussed. And it begins, of course, with the knowledge that we glean from others, hence reading books. Love reading books, got a lot of books. It's one of the best ways, one of the most effective ways that we pick up the knowledge of those that have gone before us. Woo! That's better. Okay. And then over time, you add to it your knowledge, which you gain from your experience of serving God and ministry, of the things that went right, the things that went wrong, the things that happened that you didn't expect, etc. Hence my comment about the autobiographical nature of theology. You are part of your understanding of God. And so those involved in ministry need to be developed in their own theological reflection, and that takes time. It takes a period of years to build that up. First-year theology students, they think they know everything because they wrote an essay on it. But it actually takes time to build up a quality of knowledge that's necessary to be effective in ministry. And also it moves in seasons of lives. Our lives move in seasons. Our families, our marriages, our relationships with our friends, where we live. These things move in seasons. And so does our walk with God and our ministry with God. It's not always the same. Maybe every 5 years or so, it's different, it's fresh, it's leaning in a different way. And pragmatically, we all choose theological leanings. So, for example, I have never really got on with Dallas Willard's stuff. Any Willard fans here? Okay, I'm really sorry. Don't like his books at all. But I love Eugene Peterson. Okay? But that's just me, okay? That's just my story. If you like, it's almost my choice. It's almost my bias. I've found a few saints to lean on who will prop me up and strengthen me in my walk as a minister, in my effectiveness. People that can be my companions in my thinking. And of course, we all have themes that we commonly return to. You'll hear some of mine in these 2 talks, etc. So knowledge is a wonderful thing. It should be rich and it should be deep, and of course it's a foundation to ministry. Another foundation is character. And character kind of comes in two halves. The lesser part is what we observe every day. By the way, you all seem to be lovely people. However, I've been in ministry long enough to know that's not the complete story, okay? Everyone always looks great on Sunday, like well turned out and polite, and gosh, aren't you, like nicer than somebody else. So that outward stuff that we see, the godliness, the manners, the expressed morality, the ethical behavior, the nicer than Jesus veneer that we all sort of put on, all that stuff, that's one bit of it. And it's not nothing, but it's not really what we're talking about when we talk about character. And certainly for church planters, we need to also have an understanding of those godliness muscles that we develop over a long time that make us strong and ready for challenges and seasons that are hard. And so these things are forged over time. There is no quick fix. You can't go to the gym in 2 weeks and come out looking like a bodybuilder. It can't happen. And character is built in a similar way. And character must be tested, and it must be proved. And character is never, ever developed in a classroom or by reading books, even though books are great. Let me give you an example. If you read a book on how to run a marathon, when you turn the last page, have you got any fitter? Of course you haven't. All you've done is position yourself to better understand what getting fitter might look like. However, the experience of getting fitter will feel very different from the experience of reading the book. And how many people do we think read the book, but then, never even put running shoes on, or they just took, the first few steps and thought, oh, this is hard, it hurts, oh, I feel exhausted, I'm so sweaty, whatever it might be, and they give up. And so character is something we can easily theorize, or we can live with a happy veneer. I mean, it's not hard to be nice around another bunch of Christians, but true character is tested through adversity, through pressure, and through the challenges of ministry that are especially apparent in church planting. And character is strongly explicit in the New Testament as a qualification for leadership. So 1 Timothy 3:10, for example, says this, those who are selected for leaders must first be tested, and then if found blameless, allowed to serve. I don't know about your country, but we don't do that much, certainly in our formal systems of selecting people. And again, how can we possibly test a student in character in the classroom? The best place to do that would be in the local church. We'll get to that in a minute. So, for example, everyone believes in prayer, but when the chips are down, the pressure's on, when your friends have left, when you feel like you're on your own, you're exhausted, you don't know what to do next, and nothing that you've ever read in a book is going to help you, do you pray? We need to know that before we send you out as a church planter. Otherwise, you're just heading for a disaster. And the only question is, how long will it be before you hit that? So your character needs to be developed, for example, in prayer, in that you need to learn how to deal with challenge. Start with a smaller one and work up. And life, of course, throws enough of those things at us anyway. And then through that, we assess how we respond, and we can be trained and developed in godliness, and we can develop the muscles that will help us to be effective in ministry. So leaders in training need lots of experiences that test and develop their character and their godliness. We don't protect them from it. We actually need to push them towards it. Like when you teach your child to ride the bike, and they're going to have to get a few cut knees in order to master this skill. But overall, as a parent, my assessment is it's going to be worth it, okay? I'm happy to get their knees bruised and a few cuts and scrapes because I want them to have the better outcome. And so training in character requires us developing through those challenges, like running a marathon. You've got to go out and make your legs hurt and your lungs burn in order to get stronger. And in order to prove to yourself that you have some sense of the capacity that might be necessary in order to see you through the next, perhaps bigger challenge. Now, there is a caveat, because I think character is also about understanding your limitations and your weaknesses. It is not about perfection, which is a fool's errand, because you won't make it this side of glory. So we need to be able to manage our weaknesses as well, so we can protect them, so we can guard ourselves from those things that might let us down. I asked a group of students recently, if you failed, right now, think about what would it be that you would fail on. And for each one, it might be something different, but whatever it might be is that area of their life that's the weakest, that most needs to be protected and managed. No one sets out to be an alcoholic. They're just too quick to have a drink to feel better. No one sets out to have an affair. It's harmless bit of flirting. No one chooses when they get married that they're going to get divorced, but it's micro steps along the way that take us to there. No one longs to be an absent parent. No one wants to burn out or to become cynical or to quit their faith or any of those things. They happen because of unresolved things that we're not aware of them, and therefore we're not protecting themselves. And character issues usually crack slowly and imperceptibly, and then they suddenly pop out. I don't need to tell you this. You live in New Zealand, okay? You have earthquakes. I live in the country with the least earthquake. We once had an earthquake. It was the front page of the newspapers. I think it was 1.1. I don't think anyone even knew, but it was just like, by the way, you never noticed, but we actually had an earthquake. So you have real earthquakes here, yeah? Nigel arranged for me to stay somewhere at Cook's Beach. We were staying there the first night, and a very loud siren went off in the middle of the night for a long time. And my wife and I were pretty certain that there was a tsunami coming. And then it went off, so we thought, and we looked out to see who else was running from the house for their lives. And then we thought, there must be another explanation. Turns out it's the fire brigade alarm. And they have a system where they like to wake everybody up when they just need a couple of people to come and put out a fire. So thanks for that. But you all know what it's like. You know, every day the tectonic plate moves a millimeter or whatever, and you don't notice it, do you? You don't notice it. It just moves. The next day it moves a bit more. And the next, harmless. Nothing bad's happening. Don't worry about it. And then one day, it's the tipping point, and there's a quake, and the bad stuff happens. And character issues erupt like that. And people live with the lie that it's fine, and it's okay. And then one day, something cracks. And too many leaders are operating as if they're invincible superheroes, when in reality they're perhaps heading for a fall. So I hope you have some awareness of the limits of your areas of weakness. And I've said some of mine, and I'll just be really honest and tell you. So I have a couple. My father was an alcoholic. His brother was an alcoholic. His other brother was an alcoholic. My father's father was an alcoholic. Do you think there might be an issue for me to attend to there? Actually, I don't think I'm in danger of being an alcoholic, but I'll tell you what I am in danger of doing. When I'm stressed, I eat. I go to the pies. And I've had a stressful year this year with all sorts of things, and so you're looking at some character here. Now, it might be harmless, but actually I don't think it is. I need to attend to, okay? Because it's not okay. And I can give all sorts of reasons why it's okay, doesn't matter, it's not a big issue. But actually, I need to address that. And I know how I've done that in the past, and I'm going to be working on that. And because of my story with my father, sometimes I have challenges in relating to authority, etc. And I know where it comes from, but I also know how I can manage it, how I can protect myself from the harmful effects of it. So character is both that which we strengthen, but like any athlete who knows I've got a dodgy knee when I run this, on a cold day, blah, 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 it plays up, so I wear a brace or I protect myself. We know how to guard and look after those things. The third element of training is skills. And these are not the basic skills that I mentioned earlier. I'm thinking of strategic ministry skills, things that are assembled from our theological wisdom and from our character strength, from our godly missions, from our accomplishments, from our experiences, from our spiritual expertise. These skills are like ministry in action. They're applied character that's filtered through the theological wisdom and confidence that we've gained along the way. And these are the things that can help us to be effective in ministry. And again, they take years to develop. These are formational things that don't come just by graduating with a diploma from college. That's when it actually begins that we develop those skills. And I think they're best developed through apprenticeship, and we're going to get into that in a minute. They come best under the guidance and the support and the instruction of a more seasoned leader. And they're developed in real context, in ministry context. They're best developed through kind of on-the-job experiences where the ministry is also at the same time the environment for learning about the ministry. Now, there are exceptions to that list that I've given you, but by the way, you're not one of them, okay? There's a few people I thought it'd be funnier than that. There are a few people in the world that can bypass all that stuff and they can have a fantastically successful ministry right through to the end and they can finish well. But most of us will be fools to bypass those things, to not attend to some theological knowledge, to not address our character, and to not develop our skills. Well, with this in mind, I wonder if we could just briefly look at a passage of Scripture. I'll read a brief excerpt from it. A scenario where one leader is raising up another, which will give us some help in understanding some of these issues that we're talking about. And it's the story of Elisha and Elijah in 1 and 2 Kings. Elijah is the seer. He's presented to us in 1 Kings 17. He's the one that foretold the drought in Israel, so he was a prophet of old. He's the guy that was on his side and is fed by, they brought in pies or whatever it was, the ravens. He performs the miracle for the widow. He confronts the bad king Ahab. Yeah, he has the jewel of sacrifices on Mount Carmel. He then hears God tell him, go and anoint 2 kings and Elijah as prophet, and so he goes to find Elijah. And let's just read a little snippet of that story from 1 Kings chapter 19. He departed from there and found Elisha, who was ploughing with the 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. And then he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I'll follow you. And he said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate it. Then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. You'll know the story of Elijah and Elisha, but what it gives us is a profound example of one person raising up the next generation of leaders. It's said that Elisha received a double portion of Elijah's anointing. It doesn't mean twice as much. It means twice the division of shares that are given to children. But we do read in the passages that follow that Elisha performed twice as many miracles as Elijah. The story is provocative because it shows us an example of a leader who is willing to raise up somebody to inherit their task, if not even to go beyond them. And in our days, actually, many leaders lack the security to be able to do that. And very often our systems and our models in churches are really about raising up supporters rather than developing successors who go beyond them. And Carl talked about the church that I was leading, and one day God very specifically told me that I should raise up leaders who would go beyond me, and some of them have. And another year when I went back to God and said, is this still true? Do I still have to do this? God said to me, you'll be famous for your children, as in the children I raise up in God. And that's true. And some of the people that were in my church that I've raised up, sometimes I meet people that know them and they say, oh, are you in Miriam's church? And I'll think, darn it, Miriam's in my church. But yes, I am. Thank you so much for saying that. That's lovely. Well, that's an example of a spiritual child kind of going up beyond them. The Old Testament prophets are often seen as self-taught solo agents that work on their own. There's a long-standing idea of an Old Testament prophet being something of a lone ranger figure. Josephus, the Jewish historian, describes the Elijah relationship, and he uses the New Testament word for disciple when he describes them. The German theologian Martin Hegel says something similar. He says that Elisha's call to Elijah is analogous to Jesus' method of calling his own disciples, one that's embedded in the practice of the rabbis. Rick Kallenberg, professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, says this: the relationship between Elisha and Elijah is the definitive master-disciple model in the Old Testament, one that has long-noted Moses-Joshua parallels with numerous indications of the same kind of leading figures. Their story is significant in the King's material. It's at least 20%. It feels like the authors, the editors, wanted us to see this relationship as a key part of the overall sweep of history that's being recorded in these books. And Elijah operates in a fatherly way towards Elisha. He doesn't just train him in knowledge, but he gives him a holistic, social, and comprehensive training experience. One more like the one that we've just described that might be ideal. And it's also worth noting that the book of Kings is rich in the language of fathers and sons. References occur at least 400 times in the books to fathering and to sons. And it's particularly evident that in the Elisha and Elijah descriptive, that there's a role of Elijah having a father, not just to Elisha, but also to others in the mix. We hear about some groups that are mentioned, the sons of the prophets. Very little is said about them in the text, but we know they're there. There's a fathering, mentoring type relationship that's taking place. So in 1 Kings 19, in a moment of despair, Elijah cries out, "Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." There's a kind of fathering deficit in the country. There's an absence of that primary role within the family of raising up secure children. And the discipleship relationship between these two guys is speaking into this. At the parting, Elisha calls Elijah, "My father, my father." And Joash at Elisha's death repeats exactly the same phrase. Whether or not Elisha felt fatherless, they were both fathers to a group of prophets, schools of prophets that are mentioned fleetingly in the text. There's not a lot of detail about them, and it's hard to draw strong conclusions, but it does seem that their role is significant. There are at least 6 locations. Some of them have buildings. These are physical schools of prophets gathering. There are at least 100 members in there. And so we're starting to see a richer picture of discipleship, not just one person developing another person, which is good, a kind of master to apprentice relationship, but also a leading and investing in a whole community of the next generation of emerging ministers. Well, let's just pause for a sec, and I'd love you just to breathe, and I'd just love to know what you think is important in raising up the next generation of leaders. Let me just note, I've picked an example of a man raising up a man, and I want to acknowledge the bias there, and I'm very committed that we're raising up men and women with equality in the church. If that may or may not be your perspective, but it is mine. So I just want to say that I've just picked one example. Maybe I should have added another one as well. I wonder what you think is important in apprenticing the next generation of strategic church planters. What do you think about knowledge, character, skill, or that model of the master apprentice working together? Or maybe even the issues, like in that text, the kind of background issue of father deficit. What are your thoughts? So let's just hear a few things. I teach in college, so sometimes I pick on people, so I would volunteer. What are your thoughts? Yeah.
I think being able to empower and equip
Yeah.
people is key, even if they're in the process of studying theologically or they're going to.
Yeah.
In a theological degree to begin.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely an encouragement. But
Yeah.
when we do that, we are dealing with a really small percentage of the population. So
Yeah.
it's great to empower and equip the body of Christ as we go.
Yeah.
And those things can come in, as the people are going.
Yeah. So we need to empower and equip those at college, and not just those, because they're a small proportion, but actually the whole church is important to have that. Something else? Someone else? Yeah.
I think it's really important to make sure that mentors are changed character people themselves. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you just clone. Thank you. Otherwise, you just clone an old model again instead of having a whole new model for a new generation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good, and we'll say something about that in a minute. Something else? Oh, someone right at the back. So I'm going to keep you nice and busy. There's someone, lady right there.
Hi. I don't know if you're familiar with the gung-ho attitude of New Zealanders. Sometimes we think we can just throw ourselves in the deep end and swim.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're saying, I really like it, balances the idea that in churches, we can be chucked in and do stuff, but I think we need to have that careful balance that you're talking about.
Gung-ho's not terrible as long as we backfill with some training that will see you through. Otherwise, a collapse is probably coming, unless you are a sort of superhero. Let's have a few more. Let's have a couple more. Gentleman here. Should we do these three? Do you want to start? Stand up, sir.
My spiritual father was dyslexic.
Yeah.
He preached a terrible sermon, but his love for the Lord and his graciousness and his willingness to give me a go at doing things led me into becoming a minister.
Yeah.
Which I've now been doing for 37
Oh, that's a
years.
beautiful thing. And we recognize our mentors are not perfect. And sometimes the student teaches the master as well. There's a gentleman there just behind you. And then a lady behind him.
A former mentor of mine, the three circles you get up there, skill, knowledge, character, he would say that the character circle needs to be about 5 times the size of that.
Oh, that's good.
That actually when he was looking for key leaders, they would look at character first and foremost, and that's, and in the same way that your Hobbiton guy, they can be taught knowledge and skills, but character is something that you can't teach. It's there and it needs to be formed. So, and of course, without character, generally most things fall to bits eventually.
Sometimes people are rough diamonds, though, and it takes an eye to see someone who might, in many ways, look like they have weak character, but actually, it's there if it's drawn out. So sometimes it's that.
I think we need to teach people how to fail well.
Yes.
So how to be able to go, that's not working, that's fine. I don't have to keep chasing that. I can put that aside, go in another direction. I am not a failure. It's just that didn't work. And if they can learn to do that, then they're going to be much more resilient in their journey.
Yeah. Proverbs, a righteous man falls 7 times, which means he got up at least 6 times. So that's good. Failure, we sometimes need to describe it differently. If we call it failure, it's inevitably bad, isn't it? But we can say it's learning. And we'll get to this in a minute, but the older leader can help the younger leader to encourage them to fail, as in, go and take some risks. I'm here. okay? I'll keep you safe. You know, like you put on the padding or whatever, go boxing or whatever it might be. There's a way of actually getting people to have a healthy relationship with pushing the boundaries and seeing where they can go. Okay, let's press on. I know we're a little tight for time. In the second half of this session, I want to draw on some ideas that I have looked at, as Carl mentioned, and I've written them up more fully in a book. And those are to do with the inspiration of training in something called the medieval craft guilds. Have you heard of those? Okay, well, let me tell you a little bit about them. It's an English and European model of training, although other examples that are similar but different occurred in other nations. And it's something I've looked at both in terms of studying the text and also doing some contemporary interviews with people about how to train in this model and how to draw in things like artistry, etc. For almost 700 years, up until the Industrial Revolution, the occupational guilds were the most important, the only model of training that existed in England and in Europe. And in these guilds, youths, often young adults, were trained in skills, ethical behavior, community life, and the complexities of their chosen profession. There's some example. These are all local examples, like 30 seconds from my office in York, the Minster Stoneyard and the Minster Glaziers, the two remaining guilds in York that practice something like this ancient apprenticeship model. But back in the day, back in the Middle Ages, anyone who learned anything learnt it through an apprenticeship-style training that was under a guild. And the guilds enabled the transferring of working skills and knowledge from one generation to the next. They emerged from just family work and community activity and developed into a sort of more formal system of small businesses that incorporated training as part of their connection. All guilds centered on a workshop, which was probably just the front room of a house, but it was a community of practice and learning where novices and interns simultaneously did meaningful work and learned, and they're in the supervision, ultimately, of a master. And the guild was the community of all the workshops together. It was the center for excellence. It was the place where their trade and activity was championed. Let me make the link. Our workshop is the local church, okay? Not the seminary. Our workshop is the local church. There are a few key players in the guilds. Let me just mention some. The first were the masters, as I've said, men and women, but back in the day, it was just men. There are a few examples where it was women, but most guilds were led, most workshops were led by men who were termed masters. These were proven expert practitioners who were now plying their trade and reproducing their training into the next generation. The apprentices were novices called by the master. So think of Jesus calling the disciples. That's the type of relationship. Jesus called his apprentices to be with them. And then in between, there was this interesting role called a journeyman. Journey, French word meaning day. These were people who had graduated their apprenticeship but were not yet masters. They were skilled workers who could be paid a daily wage. That's what the word meant, a journeyman, a day paid person. And journeymen had an interesting life. They had a second stage of learning where they were kicked out of the workshop. Many guilds said you mustn't come within 30 miles of the workshop that trained you for 3 years and a day. And you were to become a wandering, they were called the wandering years. You were to wander, some people call them the tramping years. They were to wander and find another glazier, stonemason, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, whatever it might be, in another place, maybe another country, and they were to learn from them for a season and then move on. And they were to do that for 3 years and sort of collect more learning along the way through these little immersive internships. And then eventually they would return back to their master and the guild, and they would demonstrate their learning by making something stone or glass, whatever it was. And do you know what the name of that was? Anyone? So that was called a masterpiece. And if you could make a masterpiece, you got to become a master, and the guild would give you permission to open your workshop and to call your apprentices. Some guilds allowed you only one attempt at a masterpiece. If you didn't pass, you would never be a master. Some let you go away and learn a bit more and come back. Not everyone liked the guilds. Adam Smith, the economist, despised them. He wrote this: "People of the same trade in a guild seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but for the conversation to end in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices." Not everything was great in the guilds, okay? They fixed prices, they controlled who could work. If they didn't let you work, you didn't work. They controlled who you bought from, who you sold from, and ultimately that was part of their collapse, that they restricted the free flow of trade. But they were outstanding in training people and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. I want to pull out just 3 areas quickly that were aspects of this gilded, this craft style of apprenticeship training, because I think they have fresh relevance for us today. As an antidote to just thinking that it's about a classroom and then all will be well, what would it look like for us to be outstandingly good at this in our workshops, which are called local churches, where in that context we could become highly effective at raising up the next generation of strategic leaders and church planters. The first observation is about the masters and apprentices. Masters called their apprentices, and interestingly, they always supervise their initial training. If you've ever heard the word masterclass, it's tricked you into thinking that the masters should only bother to spend their time with the people who are nearly ready to be like them. But in this model, the master knew, I must start with the person that knows nothing, because I want them to start really well. And they knew their eye was better at seeing what was in error, what was right. And also, they had this idea that no 2 students are the same. So this wasn't like some kind of curriculum where you do the set 10 courses and then you come out the other end qualified. The idea was every student is an artist, an artisan. And so no 2 training pathways could possibly be the same. And it was the master's job to draw out of the student the kind of leader or whatever, the worker that they were called to be, to give some of that early guidance to understand some of the direction that their life, their trade might uniquely take. Masters chose their apprentices. I think that's interesting. Of course, there are obvious limitations in there and unconscious bias that's been mentioned already today, but there was something about the master. It must be the master that calls them. Just like Jesus said, I call you. The rabbis called their disciples. To be credible teachers, masters needed to be accomplished practitioners themselves. I keep harping on about theological college. Colleges are often full of people who are not accomplished practitioners. They're probably very, very good at what they do, but they lack the capacity to impart something about the interface of theological knowledge and effectiveness in ministry. It's not their fault. We're asking the wrong person to form the wrong thing. Actually, church leaders are probably more effective at being the masters, the people who are the accomplished practitioners, who know what it takes to do something and how to prepare someone else to be ready to do it. And masters took an apprenticeship-like approach. I've got a friend that I interviewed, and he said, I can't possibly train someone unless they come and live with me. First, because you have to be able to see what I'm like, good and bad. But second, we can't do this in snippets of an hour here and an hour there. We've got to do the whole life stuff together. I can't just do one bit, I've got to do the whole thing. And so the guilds took this kind of approach. And it was built, they built a relationship that was on trust. I have a friend that says this: in training, everything moves at the speed of trust. And trust is built through our relational experience, our interactions. It builds a bridge that allows us, of course, to begin with encouragement and positive things, but it builds a bridge to allow us to do the critical feedback and interaction that is vital to actually becoming someone who has expertise. A key role of the master is to instill confidence, and a good master leaves their student feeling that they are amazing, that they have potential, that with the help they're being given, that they can indeed do it. They can be like their master. And masters, of course, empower their apprentices. This often happens through mimicry, the most basic form of human learning where we copy another. Like one day I was hammering a nail in the door and I see my son with some plastic toy that wasn't a hammer, with something else that wasn't a nail next to me, mimicking me, because he's just following his natural human instinct that we mimic that which is modeled to us. And so again, we can do that so well in the local church. You watch me do it. Then I'll draw you in and I'll give you a bit to do. Then we'll do it together. Okay, then you'll do it, I'll help you. Then you'll do it, you've got my phone number. Then you'll do it and you'll call your apprentice and you'll train them and repeat the cycle again. And so it's about creating opportunities. And we can lead our churches in such a way that we create opportunities for people to learn. So I'll give you one example. When my church in York was growing, it was never that big, 200 at the most at our peak. But I remember when we were getting too big for our room, and I said to the church, we have two options. We either get a bigger room or a second room. I vote for the second room because it will give us twice as many opportunities for people to learn how to do ministry. So you can do your church in such a way that you're always creating those vital opportunities for people to learn how to do something that takes them on the step of being able to do more. And the master needs to spend time getting to know the apprentice, their dreams, their aspirations, the things that they're doing. It's a relationship that requires giving time, asking questions, giving feedback, providing on-the-job creating. They deliver basic training. And masters also pass on what some call secrets, not salacious information, but partly wisdom that's so trusted you would never broadcast it. I think that's true. Sometimes when I'm speaking to senior leaders and you're asking them about something, you can tell, I know you're not telling me everything. I know there's more that you know that you're not telling me. But I also know that hard-won wisdom, you don't just throw it out glibly. Some of it is only passed with those that we've covenanted to train. But other secrets are, it's more like tacit. Tacit knowledge is stuff that's hard to write down. It's the kind of wisdom that you will never properly explain in words. You kind of had to be there to know it. And if you were there, you kind of got it. And if you got it, you can carry it, and then you can pass it on to others. And so guilds and masters kind of perpetuated the learning from one generation to another. They had this phrase, the king never dies. It had nothing to do with the king. What it meant was each master passes their wisdom to the next. So it doesn't matter if the old one dies because it's been passed on. It's never lost. It just cascades down through the generations. The second point is this. We also need to train in community. Remember the schools of the prophets? They are also important as well. And rarely is somebody just mentored by an individual. In fact, sometimes people are not mentored by an individual. They only get to be part of a group. And this is learning in community. Technically, it's called a community of practice. It's an environment for peer learning. It's where you can give and receive. It's actually an experience where, if it works best, where somebody is stretched far more than through their relationship with their master. The master kind of sets you up for the beginning. The community is what exposes you to be stretched and challenged, partly because you're exposed to a wider array of gifts, because your master only knows that which that person knows, which is why you need to learn from many. The community that you're in, the community of the guild, however it might be, is a place where there are many people to learn from. And there are lots of examples of this. I mean, think of the Methodists. They're outstanding at creating different types of group to facilitate ministry and learning and training. Small intimate groups of 3, the bands, the select bands, the classes, the societies, the whole region, the circuit. They understood the power of learning in community and the context of a community to be a place of learning. And so through these types of groups, we can get personal support, we can get encouragement, we get feedback, we can get review, we can be stretched by new ideas, we can get further opportunity for participation. I've got a friend that trains musicians. She's a music teacher. She said, Christian, I always put them in a band. Why would I just train them to play an instrument? I need to get them in a band so they're having experience playing. That's what they're training for, so let's get them in a band from the very beginning. It'll be a terrible band at the beginning, but that's okay. It'll be a learning experience for them. And then, as we said, communities are a place where tacit knowledge is held and passed on. It's the collective memory. And by the way, I think we've lost the wisdom of church planting. It skipped a few generations. It's our heritage because every church was once planted, yeah? Somebody planted the church you're in, perhaps for bad reason, perhaps for good reason. It's the apostolic wisdom of our church, but in the last century, we kind of just forgot it. Certainly in my nation, we did. And we just assumed these churches have always been here, and they will always be here. But they won't always be here unless we're able to renew and revitalize them. And the third dimension is this, creativity, which is an unexpected idea. But remember that I told you that the guilds treated everyone like an artist. After the Industrial Revolution, not only did people lose their jobs to machines, but then jobs became like machine work. And we've carried some of that into our generation, and we've lost some of the idea of artistry, which is actually a really important fit with Christian ministry. It's a great way of thinking about how to train church leaders, because no two contexts can ever possibly be the same. So I think creativity is massively undervalued in our training experiences. We too often model the church on being a business rather than being a studio of artisans. And creativity, of course, is the skill that enables contextualization. Why a church is different? Well, there are not good reasons sometimes, but the best reason why no two churches are the same is because no two groups of people are the same. The people who are being served here are different from the people that are being served here. The people that are leading here are different from the people that are leading there. So, of course, it should bear the family likenesses of the kingdom, but it also should be contextually relevant to its context and those that lead. And the skill that does that, I think, should be best determined as creativity. Here's what one person I interviewed said. The church plant needs to fit the context, and it mustn't be just a copy or a clone of the church they're being sent from. So I encourage people to listen deeply to the context and to God. Something is being created through that church planting experience that is bespoke and unique to that fit and that context. Being creative is part of being human, because our God is creative, and we inherit something of his image. God's the creator. God's the one who pulled the rabbit out of the hat without a rabbit or a hat. You know, he just said, da-da, and it was there. It's got technical terms, but that's what he did, you know. So none of us can do that. You can't create matter, unless you're a superhero. But you get to play with the things that God makes. And that's what artists do. They take that which God has made in ideas and things that we create from, and they do the artistry with that. So creativity is our God. Creativity is something we've inherited. Everyone is creative. We imagine creativity comes out in certain styles, but it can come out in all sorts of styles. And I think everyone can be taught how to be creative. My friend that said that people need to live with him, he also said to me, I said to him, what do you do the first day you get a curate? He said, it's easy. I always do the same thing. I take them to the Tate Modern, and then I give them questions and I send them off. And I want them to learn about the infinite possibilities of serving God and his creativity. Wow, how good is that? And I'll speed up, we're nearly there. Developing creativity is interesting, and I do want to explain this to you because I think it's often misunderstood. And it's one that the master can supervise well. In the first stage, it's about laying down basic competencies, the skills that get built into the big skills, the things that become the building blocks. Think of the child practicing the piano scales, saying, I hate the scales, da, 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 da. You know, and they do that. But you know that child will never be able to play a song until they can master the scales. The scales are developing a skill that's kind of necessary to allow something that might look like creativity to come out. So the first stage is about laying down basic competencies. The second stage is about almost taking a bold position to actually now to start taking risks and to be daring. Some say that it's released best through a youthful and playful approach to bold risk-taking. How do you like to do some of that? How do you like to go church planting with a youthful and playful approach? Think of the jazz pianist who plays that incredible song, Never Before Heard, that fits perfectly the scene. It's not come from nowhere, has it? They practiced scales. They played other people's songs and mastered them, and that set them up to have strong skills to be creative where they could produce something unique and never before seen. Let me quickly close with a few headline suggestions, and we'll pick up some more of this tomorrow. How do we apprentice strategic church planting leaders? First, accomplished church planters and church leaders are probably the most important trainers for new church planters. The theological college is important, but the person leading your church is probably the best, most strategically placed person to be training the next generation of leaders. Certainly for a big part of their journey, certainly for the beginning part, and maybe some of the middle, and some of the end as well. And so these people should be prolific in creating space for people to learn in the workshop that is their church, and in calling apprentices, and giving their time to those who are at the very beginning in order to set them off on their path well. Second, church plants and sending churches are the best context for training. Can you guess which churches are quickest to plant? It's plants. Church plants are the most likely churches to plant again, because the context is the best context for training and raising up the next generation. The third is that creativity is a vital component of church planting. To be fully effective in a post-Christian era where everything is moving, culture is moving, the church is moving, our lives are moving, all those things are moving, the ability to work contextually is now a non-negotiable vital skill, which means we all need to develop our muscles of creativity. And we need to develop them in the two stages, the laying down competencies and then the kind of the adventure of pulling them together and making them work. And the last two, apprenticeship models of training make training more accessible to a wider range of people. You see, if we have a model that's about reading lots of books and writing essays, then our training pathways will always favor those who are academic. But think about the Bible. I mean, St. Paul was clever. He'd have done really well at college. But what about St. Peter? I mean, he probably couldn't even read. But Jesus gave him the keys to the church. So I think we're out of step with Jesus if we don't know how to train someone like Peter, who's got a calling, led a business, he was successful, he was effective, but he didn't necessarily fit that training model. And yet he's seen by us as one of the foundational leaders of the church. And the final point is this: denomination churches and all churches should be forming networks. the guilds of our modern day, the places where we can champion these skills we're trying to develop, the places where we can hold this tacit knowledge, the place where we can encourage and develop others, where people can move around and they can complete their journeyman years by learning from here and here and here and here, and the place where we can give good support, good feedback, review, and opportunities for deep learning. Amen.
Okay, that's great.
I'm glad you
Just a few announcements before we go to lunch. The workshops will start promptly. We'll have caught up with ourselves time-wise. So the workshops will start at 1:30, and Justin Duckworth's workshop will be in this auditorium, and the other 3 workshops will be in our Jordan Centre. So if you basically walk in a dead straight line with my arm, there are 2 doors at either side of the kitchen. Both of them will go towards the Jordan Centre. It's a kind of little conference centre behind the church.